Okay, so in the portfolio sheet, this is actually not that difficult. So how about we go through this using Excel first, and then we'll go through it using functions and subroutines, so you guys can sort of get a feel for what we're doing. Now, that said, a lot of what we're doing in this code here, we've already done before. So it's quite similar, except there's small changes here and there that might trip you up. But I think, generally speaking, you should be quite familiar with what we're about to do in this section. So first of all, we're trying to find the expected return of a portfolio. So that's quite easy. That's just the transpose of the weight matrix multiplied by the returns matrix. So the way you do that is equals mmult, which tells Excel that you want to multiply two matrices. The first matrix you want to multiply is the transpose of the W matrix. Okay, now comma, the second matrix you want to multiply is the R matrix, and close brackets, Control Shift Enter, and you should get 0.1382 as your expected return. Now let's move on and try and find the standard deviation of the portfolio. The standard deviation is given by W transpose times sigma times W, and then you take the square root of that. So sigma here is given here. That's the variance covariance matrix of the portfolio. So first of all, we want to find W transpose times sigma. So that is, I have to highlight all of this, sorry. There we go. And then we go equals mmult. Again, just like before. The first array is the transpose of W. So we do that, find the transpose of W, then brackets, comma, and then we want the variance covariance matrix, and then we close the brackets, Control Shift Enter, and we should get the result in here, okay? Now what we want to do here is we want to take W transpose sigma, and then you multiply it by W, and then you also take the square root. So just like the hint tells you here, don't forget to find the square root. So this is quite easy. It's just equals square root of mmult, and this is the first input right here, and then comma, we want to multiply that by the W matrix, just as it's given here, because this here is W transpose times sigma, and you want to multiply that by W, so W is given here. Okay, so close the brackets twice, and then Control Shift Enter, and you should get the standard deviation of your portfolio. Okay, so let's move on to writing the functions. I've opened up the VBA to the module that we worked on yesterday, where we had the code for the matrix transposition and the matrix multiplication. Now, in order to write a function to calculate this expected return, it's basically just combining these two things. So if you're an advanced programmer, what you can actually do is just call these functions in succession. But what I'll start with doing is actually, before I talk about calling functions, I'll talk about how we can combine these functions to give us what we're looking for here, okay? Now, let us create a new function, and we'll call this function portfolios1. And it'll take two inputs, W and R, okay? And those are going to be ranges. Now, first of all, we have to find, okay, so first of all, we have to think about this for a second. What we want to do is we want to multiply R by the transpose, sorry, we want to multiply the transpose of W by R. So the transpose, like we've said many times, switches around the rows and the columns. So what we can actually do is, you know what, I will rename these input 1 and input 2, INP1 and INP2, just so we can copy the code from this matrix mult algorithm up here. Okay, and now the only thing we have to change is that instead of having matrix mult here, it will be portfolios1, because we have to output to the name of the function, right? Okay, so all this is the same, except there are a few things that we have to consider. The first thing is, you're right in the sense that for input 1, the W matrix, now it's no longer W, it's going to be W transpose. So in actual fact, the number of rows and the number of columns are going to be switched around. So what that means is that the number of rows of W transpose is actually the number of columns of W. So it's going to be inp1.columns.count. And this one is going to be inp1.rows.count. Okay, that's the first change we have to make. Now the second change that we have to make is here inside this temp thing, having input one AC is basically going to call on W, but we want to multiply it by W transpose. So we have to switch the rows and the columns. So this becomes C, A. If you don't understand why, think about it for a second, and I think you'll be able to understand why that's the case. And I think that's all. And now we can call this. So how about we call this equals portfolios1. Okay, this is our input 1, comma, input 2, close brackets, control shift enter, and we get 0.1382 as required. So that's the same as the subroutine. Now, in order to, sorry, not the subroutine, the same as Excel. Now, in order to write the subroutine, it's basically very similar, except we have to find some way of inputting in input 1 and input 2, and some other way of outputting. Now, I'm going to tell you right now that this is very easy. So the way you can do this is much like we did with the previous part. All you have to do is copy this code over into a subroutine and then try and figure it out. But the other way that is actually quite intelligent, I guess, is that you can actually call a function from within a subroutine. So this is actually a very useful thing to be able to do. And let's say we go back to our sheet here, portfolio sheet, and we create a subroutine called portfolios1 sub. Now, inside the subroutine, remember that we want to call this function here, and this function is called portfolios1. And portfolios1 takes two inputs, input 1 and input 2. Now, input 1 and input 2 are going to be ranges. So let's see if we've defined these ranges here. We haven't. So how about we call this range here W, enter, and we call this range here R. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to pass the function W and, whoops, I don't think this name came through. Okay, so W, yep, and for some reason that didn't allow us to call that R, so we'll just call it lowercase r then. It doesn't want to do it, so I don't know why, but that's a small issue. Okay, so we can call the function from within this subroutine. We know that it's going to return us with a matrix. So how about firstly we define an output matrix, and we'll call that out. Okay, so that's the output matrix. Now, realistically, we know that this output matrix is actually not going to be a matrix at all. It's just going to be a number. So in actual fact, you don't need to put this as a matrix. It's actually just one single number. So we just define out as double, okay? So it's just one number. It's going to be what stores the final 0.1382. Now, the next thing we do is we can actually call the function and pass it the relevant ranges. So the function is called portfolios1, and the input 1 is going to be range W, and input 2 is going to be range, it doesn't want to call this R, so we have to just refer to this as F17 to F25. So basically what this is doing is it's taking the portfolios function that we've written, it's passing it the range W as the first input, it's passing it the range R here as the second input, and it's taking the result and then putting it into this variable out. Now, because we're outputting as a array, not as a variable, even though it's just one number, I'm not quite sure that this is going to work. So let's run this sub and see if it gives us an error. Yep, and it does, and it gives us a type mismatch. Now, the reason for that is that it's actually passing into this an array. So there's a couple of ways around this. Now, we know that what we want is just basically the first element of the array. So we can just do this quick trick whereby we define out1 as an array. So this is going to be out1. And then instead of doing that, what we're going to do now is we'll just take the first element of out1 into a variable called out. Okay, so we'll define also a variable called out. and out is going to be just the first element of out1. Okay, that makes sense to everyone. So let's run this. And it doesn't spit us an error, so that's good. We can debug it, but I'm just being lazy. If it doesn't spit out an error, that's good. And all we have to do now is set the value of this cell here, I21, equal to out, okay? Okay, so you know how to put a variable into a cell. That's easy enough. So let's run this code, and you can see clearly that it's 0.1382 as required. Okay, so now let's move on. Here, notice that we're doing basically exactly the same thing as what we've done before, except this is W transpose R, this is W transpose sigma. So for the function here, you can actually call the same functions that we did before. Portfolio is 1, but here you're using sigma instead of R, okay? So let's do that. Okay, portfolio is 1, the first input is W, comma, the second input is sigma, so it's this, close brackets, Control Shift Enter, and you should get the same results by the looks of it as this. I think the rounding is slightly different. You've got more decimal places here, but it is the same numbers as what we're getting with Excel. Now, to do this using the subroutine is not difficult. In fact, it's basically the same thing as what we did up here. We can basically make a subroutine that calls this function. The only difficult part about the subroutine is when you want to output it, you're going to have a for loop which outputs an array into the subroutine. Okay, so how about we go back to VBA and I demonstrate what that actually means. So we write a second sub called portfolios sub2, portfolios to sub. Okay, and here we basically want to do something very similar to up here. So we'll actually copy this and paste it down here, and we'll modify it accordingly. Except now we don't have this out business because we're no longer working with just one variable. We're actually working now with 9. So we'll delete this, and we have out1. And we want to pass it W. Now the second range we want to pass it is this sigma. So it's not F17 to F25. It's actually C29, 29 to K37. Okay, we can pass it into the function. Now this code here is gone. We no longer have an out. Now we want to output this using a for loop into this subroutine here. So basically, it's going to output into this array out1. Now out1 is going to have 9 elements starting from 0, so 0 to 8, and we want to output that into this series of, this row, so a series of columns on this one particular row right here. So how about I first start by giving this a cursory run. I should delete this line. Let's give this a cursory run and see if it spits us any syntax errors, and it doesn't, so that means that somewhat the syntax is okay. Okay, now from here we just need some code to be able to output it to the range of cells required. So, so the range of cells required is N41 to V41. So all you have to do is range N41 1 to V41 equals out1, because out1 is the output of the previous matrix. Okay, so let's run that and see what you get, and hopefully this should be here the same as what you got for the function. Now it looks the same except the rounding's a bit different, but I think the rounding is set in the sheet. You can't really control it, but it's the same answer, so that's good. And now all we have to do is move on to the final task. So for the final task, I'll do this using a function, and I'll let you guys convert that to a subroutine. So let's go back to module 3 here. And we'll write a new function called portfolios2. Now portfolios2 is going to take 2 inputs. It's going to take essentially the input from here, which is W transpose sigma, and the second input it's going to take is W. Okay, so let's call them input 1 and input 2. Now we can just simply copy the code for the matrix multiplication into here. But remember that we're not doing this whole transpose first stance. It's simply taking this matrix here multiplied by the W matrix. So there's none of this trying to transpose it in the process. So we'll go back to the original matrix mult function here, and we'll copy this across. Now, there's actually a reason why I didn't want to just use the matrix mult function. And the reason for that is because we have to find the square root, so it's slightly a bit different. But let's copy and paste it here, and inside portfolios 2. Okay, and there we have our code. Now remember that this is no longer called matrix mult, it's called portfolios 2. And that is good. So we're outputting something. Now it's no longer just going to be an out matrix. Now the thing that we have to remember here is that even though this is an array, it's only going to have one value in it, which is going to be basically 0.2402 squared, not the square root of it. So what we'll do here is we'll just simply define a variable, okay? And all we'll do is, instead of taking out, we'll call this out2, instead of taking out as what we're after, we'll take the first element of out and put it into out2. Okay, and then all portfolios 2 is the square root of out2. Okay, so let's call the function, and hopefully it should work. Portfolios 2, the first input is this matrix here. We can call any of these three, it's the same thing. I'll just use this one, but you can use any of them. Comma, the second matrix is the W matrix here. Okay, so Control Shift Enter, and you should get 0.2402 as required. So I'll let you guys work on the subroutine for that. Remember the principles of copying a function to a subroutine, and I shall talk to you next week.